Why should a 58-year-old farmer be blamed for his brand-new tractor, one with barely 160 hours on it? Dale Mercer had his answer ready, and it was wrong. There were half a dozen men in the parts department at Heartline Implement that morning, and every one of them heard it. Mercer slid the invoice across the counter toward Raymond Albers. The paper skidded over the cold concrete and stopped, and he smiled. "A torque amplifier doesn't tear itself apart, Mr. Albers," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You did this. The warranty doesn't pay for what a man does to his own machine." Down in the corner of the invoice, it read $2,180. Then he lowered his voice, though still loud enough for everyone to catch it. "An expensive lesson for a man your age." Raymond didn't say a word. He just looked at the paper, then at the man's face, and the whole room went quiet. What Raymond didn't know that morning was this. Underneath that invoice lying on the counter, there was another piece of paper, one that mattered far more. A document printed on International Harvester's own presses and sent out to its own dealers. And Dale Mercer was hoping Raymond would never learn it existed. Because once that document came to light, every word spoken behind the counter that day would turn on its head. 3 months later, a man from the district office in Des Moines would drive his car up that dusty lot, and there would be no smile on his face. But that comes later. First, let's go back to how it all began. Raymond Albers was 58 years old, and he had spent his whole life on a single piece of ground. Grundy County, Iowa. A few miles outside the town of Grundy Center, the same black, heavy, rich soil his father had first broken with a plow back in the 1920s. He knew that soil the way a man knows the inside of his own hand. His father had taught him 2 things, and Raymond never forgot them. Buy good equipment and treat what you buy as if it were a part of you. As a boy, he would stand for hours beside his father, watching him take the carburetor off the old tractor and clean it. The man wouldn't explain in words why he tightened a bolt exactly so far. He would just show him with his hands. When he grew up, he became a man who did his own repairs. He wrote down every oil change, every spare part, every service date in a lined ledger that sat on a shelf in the barn. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man, a little too meticulous. That meticulousness would one day be his strongest card. But that morning, no one knew it. The spring of 1972 was full of hope in Iowa. Grain prices had started to climb that year. At the coffee tables and in the lines at the co-op, everyone was talking about planting more acres and buying bigger machinery. Raymond, who had worked the same ground for years, had taken on the extra land his neighbor was leasing out, and the old farm he had wasn't keeping up with all of it anymore. For the first time in his life, he began to think about buying a brand new, big tractor. He knew exactly what that meant, going down to the bank in Grundy Center and signing a note, taking on a debt that would stretch out over years, and carrying a new weight on his shoulders every morning. Even sitting across from the bank manager, a voice inside him told him to be careful. But for once in his life, he wanted to take a big step forward instead of back. He signed the note, and driving home that evening, he told himself it was the right decision. The day he went to Heartline Implement, everyone was exceptionally polite. Out in the lot, gleaming under the morning sun in its red paint, stood a brand new International 1066, with its deluxe cab, its dual remotes, its 125 horsepower 6-cylinder turbo diesel, a machine bigger and more powerful than anything Raymond had ever run. The price was somewhere around $13,000, and that figure was a small fortune to Raymond. Still, as he signed the papers, there was a warm pride in his chest. The salesman went over the maintenance schedule with him point by point, sold him a few cans of genuine high-tran fluid, and shook his hand firmly. Raymond drove the tractor home through the fields that evening, The smell of the new seat inside the cab, the fresh paint, the new rubber, was still in his mind. The whole way home he thought about his father. He wondered what the man would have said if he were alive, and he already knew the answer. "Well, you bought it," his father would have said. "Now, take good care of it." And Raymond did take good care of that machine. He changed the fluid on schedule, used genuine Hytran every time, kept his receipts in an envelope. He never lugged the engine, never used the torque amplifier as a brake going downhill, because his father had taught him to run these machines by listening to them. Which is exactly why, that fall, when the tractor faltered for the first time while he was pulling a chisel plow in the field, Raymond couldn't tell for a moment what was happening. First, the high range slipped away from him. Then the pressure began to drop every time he shifted. The tractor would hang there a moment as if it had slipped into neutral, and the power wouldn't come back until he eased off the throttle and brought it down again. That thin, whining sound coming from the torque amplifier settled straight into Raymond's stomach. He pulled over to the side, let the engine drop to idle, and sat there a while just listening. He looked at the hour meter. That tractor didn't even have 160 hours on it yet. 160 hours. A part like that, on a machine this new, would never go this early as long as it was used right. And Raymond knew that better than anyone. He took the tractor back to Heartline because it was squarely inside the warranty period, and he didn't have the slightest doubt in his mind. This was a failure that came from the factory. Dale Mercer looked the machine over, took a few measurements, and reached his verdict in short order. The way he saw it, the torque amplifier's clutch pack had burned up, and there could be only one explanation: operator error. "These machines don't go like this if they're run right, Mr. Albers," Mercer said in that calm, professional voice of his. Maybe he'd put in the wrong fluid. Maybe he'd overloaded it. Maybe he'd hit the torque amplifier at the wrong moments. But Raymond had been fixing these machines with his own hands for 40 years. His oil receipts were in his jacket pocket right then. And yet, faced with Mercer's certain, self-assured stance behind that counter, for a moment he felt as if he were the one in the wrong, and so he couldn't say anything. He just pushed his hat back a little and looked at the invoice for a long time. Most men would have paid the invoice at that point, gritted their teeth, and gone home. $2,000-some on top of a banknote was a blow heavy enough to maybe shake the whole season. Maybe that was the smartest thing to do. Pay it, forget it, move on. For a moment he thought about doing exactly that. But Raymond Albers was not a man who accepted a thing without seeing it with his own eyes, and the story those burned parts told him looked nothing like a story of abuse. Somewhere inside him, a quiet but stubborn voice was saying, "This isn't right." He didn't yet know how he would prove it. Standing alone, all he had against a dealer's service manager and the huge company behind him was a stack of oil receipts. But the strange part came 2 weeks later. While Raymond was waiting his turn at the grain co-op, a farmer from a couple of towns over, a man he only half knew, sidled up to him, lowered his voice, and asked a question. One that would make him realize the burden he thought he'd been carrying alone was really just a small piece of something much bigger. The man said, "Albers, did yours go too? Did your torque amplifier burn up on you too?" That question froze Raymond where he stood, and he turned slowly to the man. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Last month. It was barely at 160 hours. The man in front of him, Vern Brower from a couple of towns over, nodded and gave a bitter laugh. The torque amplifier on his own brand new 1066, bought a year earlier, had gone exactly the same way. He too had taken the machine to Heartline. He too had gotten the operator error answer. He too had quietly paid the bill. The two men stood there among the feed sacks, looked at each other and thought the same thing. If it happened to both of us, and neither of us abused these machines, then it isn't our fault. Driving home that evening, only one question turned over in Raymond's mind. How many more? But Raymond Albers wasn't a man to settle for just hearing a thing. He wanted to see it. He had asked for the old parts Mercer pulled out. His father had always taught him to keep the part that came off. And that week, he laid them out on the workbench in the barn and studied them for hours. When a torque amplifier goes from abuse, from constant slipping, or from being forced as a brake, it leaves certain marks behind. The surfaces burn, they turn blue, the friction material melts. Raymond had been looking at marks like that for 40 years, but on the parts in his hands, there was no sign of them. In their place, on the hardened surfaces, there were fatigue cracks and small breaks. The kind of marks a part leaves when it couldn't carry the load it was meant to carry in the first place. Then he noticed something even more interesting. The number on the old part didn't match the number on the new part Mercer had put in its place. The new number was one that superseded the old with a different suffix on the end. The factory had quietly changed that part. And when a factory quietly changes a part, there's a reason for it. The next morning, Raymond drove a county over to the international dealership in Eldora. There was an older man he'd known for years working the parts counter, Cliff Henning. Raymond handed him the paper with the two numbers written on it, and only asked, "Cliff, can you tell me what's between these two numbers?" Cliff looked at the numbers, then at Raymond's face, and hesitated a moment, because there was a limit to what a dealership man could show a customer. But he'd known Raymond for years. He went into the back room, and when he came out, he had a thin sheet of paper in his hand, a dated service bulletin the factory had sent to all its dealers. The bulletin openly admitted that the torque amplifiers on early production 66 series tractors came up short under certain conditions, and it recommended a heavy-duty unit in their place. In other words, the factory had known this part was weak long before Raymond ever bought his tractor. No one had found this piece of paper because a document like that wasn't shown to farmers. The men who were blamed had either paid up and stayed quiet or gotten rid of the machine. Raymond, though, had kept the part, read the number, and asked the right question of the right man. Now he had the factory's own paper in his hands, but Raymond sensed it might not be enough on its own. A bulletin could be brushed off as routine product improvement. He needed a pattern. From that winter into the spring, he quietly made the rounds. At the co-op, in the auction yards, at the coffee tables, in the church parking lots. Every time he asked the same plain question: did you buy a new 66 series, and did the torque amplifier go early? As the answers came in, he kept a small notebook. Name, date, hours on the tractor, the bill that was paid. It started with Vern, but it didn't end there. One farmer pointed him to another, and that one to the next. In the end, in his notebook, there were 9 more names besides his own. All in the same area, all the same failure, and all given the same "your fault" answer. 10 men, 10 identical failures, 1 single part. It was possible for one man to make a mistake, but 10 men making the exact same mistake was no longer operator error. It was a defect. Raymond did the right thing first and took the bulletin to Dale Mercer. For a moment he hoped the man would back down. But Mercer gave the paper a glance and shrugged. "This is a routine product improvement, Mr. Albers," he said, in that same calm voice. "The factory is always improving its parts. That doesn't mean yours was defective. Your failure is still operator-caused." Then what he said next ran down Raymond's back like cold water. He implied they could place a lien on the machine over the unpaid invoice and hold the tractor if it came to that. Raymond thought of his banknote. If the tractor were tied up with $2,000 on top of it, the whole season would be in danger. In desperation, he called the district office in Des Moines and asked for the service manager, but the voice that came back was the same. These were isolated incidents. The company stood behind its dealer. There was nothing to be done. In that moment, everything seemed over. He had the factory's own paper in his hand, but no one would listen to him. Most men would have stopped right there, hung up the phone, and accepted the loss. But Raymond didn't. He sat down at the kitchen table and wrote the district office a long, calm letter without a single angry word in it. He put a copy of the bulletin inside. He listed the 10 names, the 10 dates, the 10-hour readings, the 10 bills from his notebook, one by one. At the end, there was just one almost polite sentence. He wanted to know how the company explained the same part, going the same way 10 times in the same area, with the farmer blamed every single time. Before sending it, he set aside a copy for himself. When he dropped that envelope in the mail, he didn't yet know that the man who would sit at the other end and read it would drive his car to Grundy County a few weeks later and would leave that dusty lot a very different man than he arrived. And at last, the day that was promised at the very beginning arrived. Howard Lentz drove his car into the lot at Heartline, and there was no smile on his face. There were men in the parts department again that morning, some of them names from Raymond's notebook. Raymond laid everything he had out on the counter, in order, the old part cracked with fatigue, the old number, the new number put in its place, the factory's bulletin, and the list of 10 men. He didn't say much. He showed the papers one by one, then stepped back and went quiet. As Lentz looked them over, his face changed, because he knew that bulletin too. It had gone to every dealer, which meant it had gone to Mercer's desk as well, which meant Mercer had known from the very start that the failures he was denying were a known defect. The very paper Raymond was never supposed to see had now become the thing that turned everything around. When Lentz raised his head and looked at Mercer, you couldn't hear a sound in the parts department. The company had no options left. What stood before them wasn't one angry farmer, but a documented pattern and their own signed papers. Within a few days, the decision came, and it wasn't just for Raymond, but for everyone in the notebook. The warranty was honored. Every tractor got a new heavy-duty unit at no charge, and the bills that had been paid were even refunded. Raymond Albers ran that tractor for 20 more harvests, and the heavy-duty unit they put in never failed again. He got his money back, paid off his banknote on time, and went on farming the land he'd leased for years. The other 9 families in his notebook got their money and their repairs too. And the machines the factory built in the years that followed came with that strengthened new unit. As for Dale Mercer, after a while, he was no longer at Heartline, because the reputation of a man who tried to cover up a defect he knew about doesn't last long in a small town. Raymond didn't play the hero, never said, "I told you so" to anyone. He just put the burned part, the copy of the bulletin, and the lined ledger away in a drawer in the barn. What his father had taught him years before was exactly this. From the very beginning, before you let someone else define a thing for you, see it with your own eyes. Maybe you too have stood in front of a counter like that somewhere in your life. You had a bill in your hand for something you didn't do, and the person across from you spoke with such certainty that for a moment you even doubted yourself. Often the hardest thing isn't knowing you're right. It's being able to go on believing you're right while everyone is telling you you're wrong. The only card Raymond had was being patient enough to keep a part that came off a machine, and stubborn enough not to let go until he'd asked the right question. If stories about quiet people, about patience, and about the truth that finally comes to the surface means something to you too, you can subscribe to keep hearing them.